All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our virtual talk. Just a couple of housekeeping and some reminders. We ask that you please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the presentation. If you're joining us on if you're joining us from Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We will be monitoring those and answering them at the end of the program as well. And please note that the talk is being recorded and streamed live. And it will be posted on our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or any other previous tours or talks, please visit our Facebook page. And I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Miss Karen Helmerson, who will give an amazing lecture today. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Karen.
Thank you so much. Without Tiffany, I don't think this would be possible. She does so much with our production, our PowerPoints, and helping me. So I really appreciate that, Tiffany. You know, the High Renaissance in Italy is a very short period of time, but many of you probably have some working knowledge of the High Renaissance because of the interest in people have for Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante. So I hope that you have some questions and I hope that I can answer them. But we'll begin, we're looking at a Raphael. Raphael was considered the quintessential painter of history, of the Madonna. He was also an architect. And that's what's really interesting about the main artists we're going to talk about. As I mentioned, Bramante as an architect, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. So these four men were at the pinnacle of what we consider High Renaissance. But there were some other artists that I'm going to talk about who are actually the teachers of these great men and helped in their evolution of becoming great artists. What is the Renaissance all about in Italy? Of course, the Renaissance exists in the north, but we're going to be focusing on primarily two cities, Florence and Rome. The High Renaissance really only lasts from 1495 to about 1520, 1525. It's a very short time period. Some people say it ended in 15, I believe, 20 with the death of Raphael. Others believe that it ends with the sack of Rome in 1527. So there are some various time interests in when this period ended, but it was very short-lived. So let's say maybe 25, 30 years. Did the Renaissance begin in Florence? Well, we're going to start our presentation. Not exactly. The Renaissance really begins in Siena. Siena, it has a very lively Renaissance community. However, with the plague and some more political issues, the Renaissance really moves to Florence. Why is Florence such an important city? Well, it was a very significant city-state. That meant that the city itself had great political clout and power, and it controlled the surrounding areas. Who controlled it? Of course, the Medici. So the Medicis were actually not a highborn family. They were more of a farming family. But over the course of 300 years, from about 1200 on, they ruled this region of Florence. Under several Medicis, they supported the arts, building, commerce. They were bankers and they were wool traders. So the papacy controls Rome, is where the Renaissance, High Renaissance really kind of moves. Not to say that artists aren't creating in other cities, Milan, for example, Venice, but these two cities are the primary seat of the Renaissance. A couple other things, it's a very rich time, so I do want to spend a couple minutes. We are looking at a Raphael, so please continue to look at this beautiful painting while I give you just a little overview. So High Renaissance was, as I said, brief period of brilliance, 1495, 1520, 1527, and it was really where art was enhanced. They began to understand perspective in such a great way. They understood the power of a psychological aspect to their paintings, linear perspective, the use of chiaroscuro and sfumato. Sfumato is a lighter shading, and you'll see that when we look at some of the Madonnas. But there's naturalism, there's the real world. And we'll talk about how each of these artists kind of presents those aspects. For example, Leonardo da Vinci did something like 2,500 drawings of the natural world, studying bird flight and the landscape. So these artists were very interested in realism. They were interested in humanism. Humanism is a theory that moves away from the medieval times. Humanism begins to develop this idea that humans count, people count, and it's not just the church or dogma, it's human endeavor. And of course, we think of that when we think of how the Medicis believed in humanism and human endeavor and human creativity. And we also see this use of anatomical perfection. So we have humanism. We have the interest in Greco-Roman antiquity in writing and also in architecture. We have also, besides humanism and this interest in Greco-Roman architecture, we have people who are really documenting what is happening in the Renaissance. And you would want to look at the work of Vasari, because Vasari wrote about the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects. He was also a sculptor and a painter, but he documents the life of these great artists. And in particular, what's so interesting is Michelangelo, who lived to about 88, was still alive when Vasari was documenting these Renaissance painters. So we also see the beginning of art history and the recording of time. So during this really important time period. So we talk about Florence, and Florence was really the seat of the Renaissance for only about 5 to 6 years. So some of these artists like Raphael, we're looking at a Raphael painting, worked in Florence, and then he was summoned by the papacy to go to Rome. What popes were influential? Okay, so there was Julius and Sixtus IV. And so Sixtus IV, Julius II, and Sixtus IV. Julius II builds the Sistine Chapel, the building. But under Julius, the painting by Michelangelo occurs. So let's begin with some of our artists. And if you could advance the slide, Tiffany, to the next one. Perfect. Okay, Andrea della Verrocchio, Madonna and Child, and you can see this is done earlier than what we say is the time period of the Renaissance, but we need to see its predecessors. So who is Verrocchio? He had a studio that was very influential. Leonardo da Vinci worked in his studio. Botticelli worked in his studio. But ironically enough, Verrocchio wasn't really a painter, he was a sculptor. That's another thing. When we talk today about someone, if you meet someone and they speak many languages and they're very erudite, and you might say, wow, what a Renaissance individual. This term obviously comes from the ability of these people to create in multiple medium, painting, sculpture, architecture, and create studios where other artists train. So it's pretty remarkable. So we'll begin with this tempera on gold wood. Now you will look at almost all of these works that are paintings. We're also going to look at sculpture and architecture a bit. These are not done on canvas. And you might say, well, canvas didn't exist at this time. Yes, it really does begin in the 16th century, but we see more works of art on canvas if you are in Venice. So when we think about Titian, Giorgione, Bellini's, that's more on canvas, but these are on wood. So we have this beautiful Madonna, and she holds an upright baby Jesus, and he is standing on a window ledge. And we have two iconographic forms that relate to the scene. One is a rose, and that's on the left, my left, and that rose indicates the Queen of Heaven, the Madonna. On the right, we have 3 cherries. And this relates to the sacrifice of Jesus, the blood of Jesus. We also have her holding him upright, and he often jests in this hand of benediction. And he has this gorgeous gossamer cloth around his waist, and you see that beautiful gossamer cloth around this exquisite face of the Madonna. You can probably see how Leonardo was influenced by the facial characteristics of this Madonna. Unfortunately, today it's not in very good shape. It's been repainted, but suffice to say, it's still an amazing masterpiece. Lastly, I do want to talk about how gorgeous her robes are. You know, she wears the blue of the church and the red of her sacrifice. And it's very richly done. These are elegant robes. She's a woman of, looks like high status, even though it is a virgin. But in the background, it is an incredible landscape. So I do see a question. I just want to repeat a statement I made. It says, what does the rose represent? It is the rose of heaven. It is her connection to heaven. It is also her purity. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the cherries would be sacrifice. So because of time constraints, I will ask Tiffany to advance to the next Verrocchio. All right. And that is a Virgin Child with angels. Now, you might look at the date and say, 1476, I thought you said 1495. But of course, it is really important in art history to look at a continuum and to see what artists influence others. And if you look at the landscape, for example, it's really very well connected to the work of Leonardo. This is a very interesting Virgin Child with two angels because, as I mentioned, Del Verrocchio was really a sculptor. He really has only a handful of paintings extant that we think were done just by him. In fact, this one was a collaboration with his student, Lorenzo Credi. So Lorenzo Credi, along with Botticelli, Leonardo, were in the same workshop. So how do we know? Let's examine the two angels. If you look at the two angels, look at their hands. Hands are a very good indicator of an artist's skill. I've probably said it 100 times. And if you look at the hand on the right and the hand of the angel holding the lily, the purity of the Virgin, he clutches it beautifully. His hand is so much more elegant and beautifully done. If you look at the angel on the right, the hand is a little more, it's a little meatier, a little more, I hate to use this term, but a little paw-like. And the angel also, facial characteristics is not quite as well developed as the angel on the left. Also, look at the toes of the infant Jesus. They're rather unusual, and it's very much a sign that Lorenzo Credi did it. If you look at other paintings by Credi, you will see that. The Virgin is completely by Verrocchio. That is done by him. Something that's really interesting in this painting, and again, you see the ubiquitous blue and red, the blue robes of the church, the red of sacrifice, and some ornamentation on her robe. She also has that beautiful, serene face as she looks at her infant and maybe contemplates his future. What is remarkable about this painting are the drapes. So we're looking at almost like a theatrical situation, but we have this incredible landscape in the back. So it's almost like we're saying we are revealing, the artist is saying we're revealing this world to the viewer. Also, look how beautifully elongated she is, very exquisite Madonna, and then, of course, as the baby rests in her lap. So again, this was not a high Renaissance painting. This is typical of the Renaissance, but it leads us into the work of Leonardo da Vinci. So if we could, a couple of the things I wanted to say about Del Verrocchio, besides being a sculptor, he was also a goldsmith. He worked in Florence, and he was thought to be very important to the Medici family. He did some important equestrian sculpture, so that we have to look at both. I did not include his sculpture primarily because of our wonderful Timken collection is painting. I focus on that generally in most of my lectures, but of course, because of the great architectural and sculptural elements of the High Renaissance, I will include a few of those. So we're going to move on to Leonardo da Vinci. And if Tiffany, thank you so much, the Virgin of the Rocks. So one of the most intriguing personalities in all of art history is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci. And recently, I'm not sure if some of you saw this incredible production at the Old Globe called The Notebooks of Leonardo. And it was phenomenal. And it gave so much information about his life, his interest in drawing. Yes, and I see one of our docents actually seemed to have seen it and giving me a thumbs up. I thought it was just brilliant, and I'm not sure if they extended it. The other thing I want to say, another little anecdotal little thing I would like to mention is when I was at UCLA as an undergraduate, I was very, very blessed to take some classes from Carlo Pedretti. Carlo Pedretti died in 2019. He was the Arm & Hammer Chair of Renaissance Art at UCLA. But regardless to say, this man was such a brilliant Leonardo scholar, in fact, one of the foremost in the world. He was still being consulted well into his 80s. He died a day short of his 90th birthday. But I wanted to mention him because not only was he inspiring to me, but like Leonardo, he was experimenting with writing, reverse writing, all these interesting things that Leonardo, even as a young man, was experimenting with. So Carlo Pedretti was so captivated by Leonardo, he had seen his work as like a 10-year-old. He began to take on some of the qualities and also some of the techniques that Leonardo used. So Leonardo was constantly experimenting, drawing. He made military gear. He designed rotating like a cannon that would actually be quite lethal in warfare. He designed things that dealt with water, flying machines, and not many of his paintings are extant. However, he left something like 2,500 drawings, and that is talked about quite a bit in the Notebooks of Leonardo. He loved to record human anatomy, plant life, the motion of water, the flight of birds in motion, and probably his Last Supper, which we're going to look at momentarily, is considered the beginning, the first really, truly high Renaissance work of art. But before we do that, let's talk about this exquisite Virgin of the Rocks. This is an earlier Virgin in the Louvre Museum, and there is also a later one done in the National Gallery. And there's some discrepancies on why he painted two, but I think there was something to do with a commission. And Leonardo was a little bit feisty, and if he thought he was not getting his just desert, he would leave. And it's suffice to say that he worked in Milan, he worked in Rome, he worked in Florence, and he also worked in France. In fact, he died in France. So specifically, we'll talk about the Virgin of the Rocks. It's an oil-on panel transferred to canvas. And what makes this so remarkable is look at this grotto. This grotto is quintessential Leonardo. It shows the natural world, but it has a mystical kind of sensibility. You see the sfumato, the smoky shadowing, and also the chiaroscuro, the dark and light. Now look at the shadowing around her face. That's more the sfumato, coming from the word smoke in Italian. Look how the baby Jesus, as it's held gently by the angel, holds his fingers again in benediction, and St. John, his cousin, prays to him, leans in reverence. The Madonna is exquisite. And you can probably see some of the del Verrocchio's influence on this Madonna. Look how he captures the water, subaqueous plants, the rocks, how the rocks have been smoothed by the weathering of the rocks, how mist floats into the grotto, the beautiful, somewhat monochromatic palette of this amazing painting. So it shows his skill, his reverence for the natural world. All right, because of time, we will move on to the Sistine Chapel. I believe it's the next image. Wow. And I hope I see that Dee Dee's here, and maybe at the end, if we have a minute or two, you can fill us in a few more aspects of the this beautiful.
Yeah, this is not the Sistine though, Karen. This is up in Milan.
So sorry. Why did I even say? Okay, so I think I do know the difference. The Last Supper. Why did I say the Sistine Chapel? Totally. Thank you for correcting me. I would have said it the whole time. This is not really a fresco. And why is that? Because Leonardo was given about 4 years, 3 or 4 years to paint this in the Santa Maria della Grazia convent, but he was experimenting with some techniques, and he did not really use proper fresco techniques. He did use dry painting on dry walls, which would have been not great for saving the paint. In other words, it became very ephemeral. And so unfortunately, so much of this great work of art is really not seen. So in other words, we still see it, but it is not the rich, deep colors originally. So he's asked to paint this in the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia. A really important story, I think, from art history is that this convent was bombed. It's the rectory, so where people would probably eat. It was bombed by the Allies during World War II. And it was set, all the walls collapsed except for this one. And some people consider this miraculous. Now, there was one art historian who was aware of what was happening with this bombing and tried to stop. You're not going to destroy one of the greatest works of Western art, but we don't know really if that was effective. Many people think it was just divine intervention. And I'm not a super religious person, but you can choose how you believe to look at this. Anyway, let's talk about what we have here. So he does a very interesting set up. It's almost like a stage setting. So none of the apostles we don't look at the back, we only look at the front. And here we know that Jesus is saying, one of you will betray me. So there's a lot of emotions as he states that, he's in the center with his arms open, and he states that one of you will betray me. And if you look at the faces, they all are showing like consternation, emotion. The lines of perspective actually go toward his right cheek. So our eyes are directed toward his right cheek. And you see that the apostles are in 4 groups of 3. Let's look at the one that probably has the most, let's say, curiosity about, and that's Judas. So if you look at the left-hand side of the table, you will see Judas, and he is not the first group of 3, but he's in the second group of 3. He's wearing green, a little bit of red and blue. His face is in shadow. His elbow is the only one on the table, and he's holding a bag of silver, which might indicate that he has sold Jesus for that silver. And also there's a salt cellar that is overturned. And that indicates in the Last Supper that he spilled the salt. And that's from the Middle Eastern concept of revealing something. Now, so the vanishing point of perspective leads right into Jesus with his open arms and these beautiful windows. And there's almost like a halo that surrounds the top of his head. And it looks like almost like tapestries, and we have a coffered ceiling, and the light seems to come in from the windows. Now, Peter is shown with his hand on another figure. Some people have said that, and maybe Dee Dee could fill me in, some people say that it's Mary Magdalene dressed in like a costume. Some people say it's John. And we can talk maybe after this, maybe Dee Dee, you can fill me in on what sort of the definite decision about who that figure is. Another thing is, when Leonardo was painting the Last Supper, he was walking through the streets of Milan, and he was trying to look at people who looked very realistic. And one of the priests associated with this convent said, you're taking a lot of time. Can't we just draw this to the close, and you can find someone who would be a good Judas? And Leonardo was so a little angry with this individual. He said, if I don't find someone among the community in Milan, I'm going to use you, this priest, as a face as Judas. So that was a little bit of a funny story. So anyway, we have loaves of bread. We're breaking bread. And we can say really, if you look at the date, that this is the beginning of the High Renaissance. All right, and so unfortunately, because Leonardo experimented with techniques, it isn't really a fresco. We can say it's a fresco in general, but it's really this oil, this tempera, this use of gesso was not the smartest thing that Leonardo ever did, because it did cause a lot of dissipation of the paint. All right, if Tiffany could move on to, of course, the most famous portrait ever done, we think. I mean, this is, everybody knows the Mona Lisa. Everybody knows her. And what's so funny is so many people have seen her, probably, who were listening to this. And we know it's not very big, and now it is its own gallery. And it's had a lot of interesting history, but let's just talk about the painting. He seats her in a chair, and there is a ledge behind her. By seating her in a chair, you get this feeling that you're seeing most of her. And that was his intent. You're not seeing just a snippet. You're really seeing most of her full posture, and those beautiful hands as they lie across her wrist. She is a highborn woman. Of course, that's why her portrait is done. But she does not have the typical embellishments of a highborn woman. We don't see really any jewelry on her. Her gown is lovely, but not hyper ornate. She has a slight veil around her forehead. During the Renaissance, in the High Renaissance, women often sometimes even shaved their foreheads to get that high forehead look. And she obviously has that. I don't know how they did it then, but that was said to be a real thing of beauty. What Leonardo does too, and it's so influential in not only Italian painting, but also in the North, is include this really magnificent landscape, this beautiful landscape. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he did paint this in Florence, and it was commissioned by the man with the name of Gioconda, and so they often called it La Gioconda. Lisa was her name. Mona is Madame Lisa. So she has a couple names. Many people call her La Gioconda. She has a very, I would say, a very self-contained pose. She has an aristocratic pose, but almost the way men were portrayed at this time, not as much women. Women had a little more of a self-deprecating way of positioning himself. She does not have that. She is very self-contained and very assured. So oil on popular panel, again, you can see his use of sfumato. So when you think about shading and light, really important in the High Renaissance, and very important, of course, in the Baroque in Italy and the North. So to distinguish the difference between chiaroscuro and sfumato, sometimes there's a little bit of a overlapping, but the sfumato so clearly is seen around her eyes, that smokiness around her eyes. Now, the chiaroscuro, more her skin tone against the dark dress, perhaps would be more of a chiaroscuro, but we might be able to see it more in other paintings. So suffice to say, you're looking at probably the most important portrait ever done. So we'll move on to the quintessential architect of the Renaissance, and that's Donato Bramante. So Bramante was known as a painter as well as an architect, which is so interesting about these people. For example, Michelangelo worked on St. Peter's. He worked on the Sistine Chapel. He wrote sonnets. He did the Doni Tondo, a painting. He did sculptures. I mean, talk about Renaissance art. But he did work and was inspired by Bramante. And Bramante worked in Milan, and he also worked in Rome. His plan for St. Peter's Basilica formed the basis of that work. He wasn't the only architect. There were many architects that worked on St. Peter's, and we're going to talk about that. So one of his most beautiful works was this Tempietto, the little temple. And it is it was the basis for St. Peter's. Look at the dome. So they looked at older buildings from antiquity, for example, the Italian Pantheon, and they looked at different styles of Greek and Roman architecture, and they create this exquisite jewel-like work of art. There's so many classical references here. The balustrade and this use of Doric, what's actually called Tuscanic capitals. Remember, Doric is the first, a very basic, Ionic scrolled, and Corinthian more elaborate. This is Doric. Of course, you can see the flat top, but it's also Tuscanic because it's slightly different. And then we have a concrete dome. Remember, the Romans introduced concrete to the world. And they were the first to actually create rounded ceilings. That was not done in the Greeks. They'd use what's called post and lintel, flat top, pedimental, and columns. So the Romans introduced this rounded form. Of course, because the Renaissance, and particularly the High Renaissance, were so interested in Greco-Roman architecture, you can see the inspiration. You can see these niches inside the top story, and you can see these beautiful carving, Greco-Roman references. It's a hemispheric dome. And the other thing, it was so important because it was said to be, it was built on the spot where St. Peter was crucified. So it also represents a very important place. So this sculptural work of art, it's architectural, but it's so small and beautiful. We can look at it as both sculpture and architect. All right, so we're going to move on to the next image. And we're going to look at the staircase by Bramante. Unfortunately, I inadvertently put the secondary staircase because there's two. So there's one done in 1505, and then there was done later by an Italian architect, I forget his name, and that was done in 1932. You're looking at the staircase from 1932. So you see this beautiful metal embellishment. You see this seashell-like curved staircase, and I bet you know what this staircase was an inspiration to none other than Frank Lloyd Wright at the Guggenheim, because we have a staircase where the descending individuals will not see the ascending individuals. Now, why was this double helix design created? It was to connect the Belvedere Palace of Pope Innocent VIII to the outside, and actually built so Julius II could enter his private chambers with all his regal vestments that weighed a ton, and he would be still in a carriage, and he could be taken to his private apartments and not have to even get out of the carriage. Now, again, unfortunately, you're looking at the 20th century version, so you might not be able to see how that was even possible. The balustrade is magnificent, probably bronze. It's very ornately worked metal. And we have this kind of ability to have uninterrupted movement. Really important. So suffice to say that Bramante at the Vatican Museum creates the genesis for these two staircases that are still copied and revered today. So we'll move on, just because, of course, I'm working a little bit slowly as usual, and we'll look at the work of Raphael. Raphael also was involved with St. Peter's Basilica, and when we look at Michelangelo, we'll look there. Now, you might say, how come we didn't do it under Bramante? Bramante did start it, San Gallo, Raphael, but Michelangelo's St. Peter's Basilica was the one that was maintained, because it was even finished after he passed, and they all use his great ideas, at least to complete it. So that's why we'll look at St. Peter's a little bit after Raphael. So Raphael, unfortunately, died at 37. He probably died of what would today be like coronavirus. He's called the paragon of classicism. Nobody could paint a more beautiful Madonna than Raphael. He also did some amazing history paintings. His influence moved well into the 19th century. When you think of the pre-Raphaelites, for example, you know that they were definitely influenced by Raphael. So his father was a court painter. He saw a lot of works by Mantegna, Uccello, Perugino, who was influential to him as a teacher. He worked in Florence and then and known as a Madonna painter. But when Julius II took the work of Sixtus IV, the building of the Sistine Sixtus Chapel, he also moved to Rome, and he wanted to work with Julius II, who sponsored him. And he did many commissions for the papacy and also some of the wealthy aristocratic families. So let's look at this Marriage of the Virgin oil on panel, very interesting, shaped in this ornate frame. And we have Mary and Joseph exchanging rings, and with a priest in the center. And then we have these courtiers in elegant dress, and they're all witnessing this spectacular scene. But then our eye goes directly to this architectural form. And what does that represent? Supposedly, that's the Dome of the Rock, which is so sacred to Jewish, Muslim, and Christians. So it represents the Dome of the Rock and this form of the marriage. Now, as I said, he was influenced by Perugino, and if we look a little bit earlier, we will see the same subject matter done by Perugino, and slightly different. This, of course, perhaps is more evolved and more magnificent. Look at this idea of perspective. Look at the exquisite face of the Madonna. You can see his ability to capture not only linear perspective, beauty, emotion, coloration, all of that is taken into account when we look at this Marriage of the Virgin. So I think we'll have to go on and we'll look at something that's a little bit different. Madonna of the Goldfinch. I think in all of art history, this is one of my favorite paintings. I think it's just absolutely beyond beautiful. Look at that Madonna. And someone would ask him, do you see these women in your life? And he would sometimes say, not exactly. They're my composites of beauty. So whether this was the bride of one of the illustrious people who commissioned it, or whether it was a composite image, we're not 100% sure. So the Madonna sits on the rocks, like a Madonna of humility, because she's on the rocks, and she holds a prayer book, and she looks with beauty and rather calmness as she looks at little infant John as he holds the goldfinch. And then he proffers it to the baby Jesus. Why a goldfinch? All right, so this was painted in Florence. You can see it's in the Uffizi. Why a goldfinch? Because it was said that when Christ was crucified and he had a crown of thorns on his head, the little goldfinch flew by and tried to pluck a thorn from the crown of the thorn of crowns, a crown of thorns, pardon me. And as he plucks the thorn, blood comes forth and it lands on the little crest of the bird. So you can see, if you look closely, you can see a little red drop, a little red feather or near the beak, and that comes from the blood of Jesus. They're in a beautiful, beautiful pastoral setting. And you can think of this and look at the sky. These artists study the sky, natural world, and he beautifully details the trees, the waterways, the bridge, the landscape, the flowers at her feet, probably her purity. And you can see his ability to capture three-dimensionality on this two-dimensional picture plane, the very brilliant interaction between the two young John and Jesus, and this atmospheric quality. Just a remarkable, remarkable work. All right, so we have to go on. I apologize because we just have so much to talk about, and oh my gosh, we're really far behind. So I'm going to kind of move it along. Galatea comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it is a story because, of course, the Greeks and Romans really influenced High Renaissance, and it's a mythological scene. So there is a Nereid, a goddess of the sea, calm seas, and she's being surrounded by these creatures. She's on a shell that's being drawn by dolphins. We see these tritons trying to sort of grab these women. We have little putti shooting arrows. We have the waves and these sea creatures, half man, half fish, and they're abducting these sea myths. And she rides this chariot. Again, this is from the Villa Farnesina in Rome. It's a little bit of a smaller villa, and it was commissioned by, thought escapes me, but what happened is Polyphemus who was a Cyclops, was in love with her. And she was interacting with a shepherd. And he did not like that. So he slays the shepherd with a huge boulder, and he tries to get her to be taken, back to him. But this is her apotheosis. This is her pinnacle of strength and power. So, again, this is a fresco, wet paint on a wet wall to create sort of these resonant colors. All right, so we're going to move on to Ghirlandaio, who was the teacher of Michelangelo. So Ghirlandaio, what does that name come from? Ghirlandaio means garland. And Ghirlandaio not only was a painter, but he also trained as a goldsmith. And that's what his family had, a very well-run studio. Almost all the frescoes he worked in a lot were on tempera, which is a little bit unusual, not really so much using the oil paint. Botticelli worked with him sometimes. He liked to really do prosaic themes like the natural world. And he was very adept at creating this chiaroscuro. His technique of saturated color was pretty remarkable. And this, of course, is one of my favorite paintings too. And this is an old man with a young boy. And he has a little bit of a troubled situation with his nose. That is an advanced case of rosacea, which is a skin abnormality. It's not lethal, but of course it is not attractive. And there's so much kindness in this painting. The little boy pushes his hand against the chest of the old man, and the old man holds him in such tenderness. And it's really, like I say, very prosaic, dealing with the real world. And that was unusual for many artists, because many artists wanted to do these idealized portraits of the aristocracy, the Medici, the Sforzas, and he did not necessarily think that was always necessary. He liked to show real world themes. So you have this beautiful cloak, it's lined in fur, you look out an open window, and a beautiful landscape. So again, since I don't have a lot of time, we do need to get to Michelangelo. Let's advance to the next image. Just really quickly, a Ghirlandaio of the Nativity. And what's really remarkable is Ghirlandaio was actually in the painting. So he is pointing to the infant Jesus that seems to have a connection with this marble sarcophagus. And then in Latin, it says something about from the sarcophagus, a child will emerge. And then there's a garland, the Ghirlandaio. And then we have, of course, this kneeling Jesus and Joseph. And from far away, we have visitors and the three wise men, but who gets center stage but the peasants? Again, this interest in the real world. And then, of course, as Ghirlandaio's self-portrait as he points to the baby Jesus. And we have the donkeys. We have a very Northern Renaissance background, and that's probably attributed to the fact that he saw Hugo van der Goes's Portinari altarpiece that is somewhat similar. See that Portinari altarpiece, because that really gives you an indication of the influence. Now, we really have to look at the work of Michelangelo. I would be remiss. So let's go on to Michelangelo. And I apologize for running a little bit slow. A poet, a painter, a sculptor, an architect. In fact, people say today that, and they said it then, and even Vasari would have said it, that Michelangelo surpassed antiquity. His work was so great that he surpassed antiquity. So he trained with Ghirlandaio, and he was under the patronage of the Medici family. In 1496, he went to Rome, where he carved the Pietà for St. Peter's, excuse me. He went back to Florence, did many projects, left them unfinished, and then he was called back to Rome by Julius II to paint the Sistine Chapel. So let's just talk a little bit about this magnificent work of art. It's almost 17 feet high, just shy of 17. It's carved out of one block of Carrara marble, white marble, and it is in the Academy in Florence. Now, he stands in contrapposto, which is the posture from the ancient Greeks, where weight is balanced on one hip and a slight relaxing of the other. We have a slingshot behind him, and he holds a stone and a tree stump that is used, as they did in the ancient Greeks, to give it some bolstering. Now, for several hundred years, this sculpture actually was an outside sculpture. And there was gold leaf on the tree and also on the slingshot that, of course, washed away. And then it was brought into the Academy. What is interesting about this is he shows David before he interacts with Goliath. So it's rather unusual, but he looks like a very strong individual. It's monumental sculpture, one of the most important sculptures ever created. So why don't we go on, and we do need to look at the Sistine Chapel because of its great importance. And so let's turn to that. And the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican originally had gold stars on a blue background. Sixtus IV commissions, that's where the word Sistine comes from, but it was really Julius II who wants Michelangelo to do this. And what is such an interesting story, a little narrative here. His greatest rival at that time was Raphael. And he had not done that many paintings. At this time, he was doing more architectural projects and sculptural projects, the Pietas I mentioned, Moses, and others. So when he was called to maybe do this, Raphael and Bramante were kind of like, he's going to fail. He's not really a painter. He did the Doni Tondo. Okay. He did a few other things, but really, he's not a painter. Some people would say that this is the greatest painting in all of Western art. So he proved everybody wrong. What is this space known for? It was where the cardinals were to gather to elect a new pope. The ceiling relates to the Old Testament, and it begins to the creation of the world and goes to the flood of Noah. And actually, at the very back, 4 years later, later on, the Last Judgment fresco was seen, and it was done separately. You have something like 300 figures here. We have everything from biblical individuals to the Sibyls, which actually come from Greek mythology. So he portrays human ancestry, the ancestry of Jesus. And we also have, we have prophets, we have sages, we have stories from the Old Testament, and it's so exquisitely done, so proportional, such movement, such beauty and depth. And we have this use of grisaille, this grayness, as he does some of the Sibyls. It creates a very interesting perspective. And we see three-dimensionality on two-dimensional form. It's really remarkable. But in order to really look at it, I want to move on to the birth of man. And so if we could just go to the next image. All right, the creation of Adam. It takes your breath away in many instances to look at this. It's electric. As God is touching, and it's such a brilliant interpretation of this event. And so Adam is actually kind of reclined in a rather casual manner, and God circles him and holds the finger that creates the energy, the electricity, the tension in his creation. Now, some might say, well, where's Eve? It is said, and then, of course, Dee Dee, I might, if we have a minute, we can maybe hear about this. God has his arm around a woman on the right, and some have speculated that that could be Eve. We also see this form that surrounds the swarming figures that could be, some people interpret it as the human brain, and others interpret it as more like a uterus, and that would be holding the creation, and that green scarf would be maybe an umbilical cord. So there's several interpretations, but look at the three-dimensionality of this painting, this amazing fresco. And of course, there's been a lot of controversy because honestly, the repainting of it, the colors became rather garish. I have only seen it once, believe it or not, and it was many years ago, and it was pre-repainting. So some people who have seen it, can you imagine this is painted on a 60-foot scaffolding? Now, it is said that Michelangelo painted on his back. That isn't really true. He did not necessarily paint on his back. But when you look at how Adam, life is breathed into him by God with the touch, it's just a master stroke. And he creates physical and spiritual energy to the nth degree. All right, let's go on to St. Peter's because we really need at least a couple minutes to talk about St. Peter's. As I mentioned, St. Peter's was started with Bramante, Sangallo, Fra Giocondo, Raphael. They actually asked Sansovino, who did the magnificent library of Sansovino in Piazza San Marco, but it was really Michelangelo whose architectural genius withstood. And this basilica is the largest basilica in the world. There are 4 basilicas in Rome. This is the largest. As you know, this was not the first St. Peter's Basilica. The first one was done in the 4th century under Constantine, actually about 318 AD, and it was consecrated there, but it began to fall into disrepair. And by, by about 1500, it was really not in very good shape. So Julius, as they bring Rome to the pinnacle of development, they want it to be a grand city. They want to have architectural monuments. They want to have a planned community, roadways, fountains. The papacy really wants to make Rome the most important, powerful city in all of Christendom. So today, if you go to the Uffizi, you can actually see some of the designs of this magnificent basilica. So it was said to rival the Cathedral of Florence. Of course, its rival, the Pantheon, was its rival. So they're looking at antiquity to create this, but it's this magnificent dome that can be seen for miles. We have these exquisite pilasters that are engaged columns and the Corinthian capitals that top the pilasters, which are the engaged columns, and then of course the freestanding. We see all the sculptural endeavor, and it is probably one of the most remarkable feats of architecture ever created. And so again, because I really only have a minute or two, I just want to go on, and I'm sorry I didn't give its just deserved to St. Peter's Basilica, but I would recommend that we go back. So just really quickly, I want to look at Andrea della Sarto's work, the Madonna of the Harpies, because now we're getting toward the end of the High Renaissance, and what follows is Mannerism. And although this is not a Mannerist painting, it doesn't really occur for about 10 more years, you begin to see the evolution of Mannerism. Who really starts it is Michelangelo. This is not Michelangelo's work, of course, but the use of these rather garish colors. Why is it called Madonna of the Harpies? She is standing on a pedestal, the Madonna. She seems to emerge from a sculptural niche, and there are these harpies. And harpies are either, some people say locusts, or these half man, half bird, but they're evil creatures. And she is stepping on this pedestal that means to stamp out evil. So we have St. John the Evangelist holding the book of Revelations. We have St. Francis holding the cross. And then we have the Madonna clutching a rather large Jesus. He again, is sort of attenuated, and that we do see when we look at the later work of Michelangelo, we look at the work of Pontormo and Parmigianino, who really are quintessential Mannerist artists. So she is very sculptural, it's very dramatic, it's a very unusual Madonna and Child. So we'll have to go on. Again, I'm really losing time here. And I just want to show you this lamentation is very unique because it really crowds us into the picture plane. And I think, and I could be wrong, but it's one of the most human versions of Jesus. He really looks so human and so vulnerable. And there's such sadness and tragedy in this picture, but look so carefully, it's pushed in to the picture plane. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my time and we're really low, but if we could just go to one more, the work of Correggio. And Correggio paints this Parma Cathedral, and it's in a magnificent use of in sotto, in su. So we're looking from down below up, and we're looking at this cathedral that absolutely looks three-dimensional. We actually think we see apostles, the four saints who surround it. We have saints and apostles and musicians and, you know, Jesus and, you know, the assumption, excuse me, of the Virgin as she goes to the top, and all manner of clouds and sculptural relief. So this use of, well, sort of plein air, because it fools our eye to think that we have three-dimensionality. And we have these saints that sort of surround this octagonal form, and they look like they're carving, but of course, that is not the case. Now, for time constraints, my phone just died, so I really believe that we're at the end, and I really apologize because I didn't get to really finish up, but I know that there's probably some questions or some comments, so I'd like to end here and see if Tiffany can see if there's any questions.
Garson, thank you so much for that lecture. That was really fascinating.
Oh, I hope I did justice to it. So can I ask our own Dee Dee Holloway if we have, was it, going back to the Last Supper, who do you think was that figure? Was it Mary Magdalene? What is the assumption there?
No, I
don't think so either, but that was something I was reading. I was like, wait a minute, it does look like a feminine form, but
yeah. You know, we've had some literature. What was the one that's so famous? Anyway, a few years back, everybody was reading it, but essentially, if he were commissioned to do the Last Supper in the refectory where these monks and priests would eat, it would be really unusual to leave out John the Evangelist. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. And so
Yeah,
I should have just
right. Well,
yeah.
Now, John the Evangelist was noted. In fact, that there's a part in his gospel where Peter says, "What about him?" You know, meaning, you know, what about his future? Because Peter had been told that his would be difficult, and so Jesus says to him, "What is that to you? What if he should remain alive until I come again?" In other words, St. John the Evangelist lived until his 90s, the only apostle probably not to suffer martyrdom.
Right.
And so he would have been a very young man there, possibly even as young as 16 or 17. So the beardless look, very famous for St. John as a young man. And in the story of the Last Supper, remember, they didn't sit at tables, they had couches, Roman style. And so the story is that, Peter leaned over to John to ask him, ask him what he means. And John had his head basically toward the chest of Jesus. So the best that the artist could do was to do this leaning, which in this case it's on Peter. But
right.
I think the chances of it being Mary Magdalene are slim to nil, despite things. What was the name of that novel that came out a few years ago that was so famous?
Da Vinci Codes.
Yeah, the Da Vinci Code. And so, they read all kinds of things into that. It does sell books.
It sure does. And I actually wasn't quoting from the book. I was looking at just some interesting articles about it. And they said, well, it's just suggested. But I threw that out. But of course, Peter is holding the knife. So I think you answered my question. I think you.
Yeah, I think it's such a long shot. It would be, and also the idea would be that we know now that probably it was quite a mix of company with servants, and Mary might have been there and all kinds of followers. But classically, they only did the 12 apostles with Jesus.
Right. Perfect. Oh, thank you so much.
Okay.
Tiffany, any other questions? Or I see some chat questions.
Mhm.
And obviously, I apologize for running over. And if you have to leave and not participate, we totally understand. But if you do want to stick around for another 5 minutes, we can definitely go over some of the questions.
So it looks like there's a question from Facebook that asks, when you were talking about the Mona Lisa, why you didn't mention the smile.
That's a good question. Yeah, there's a couple things about the smile. There's that mysterious quality that really does. It's an interesting point, really. It gives us a sense of mystery. This is a very prosaic comment, but I'm going to make it anyway. We also know that at that time, people did not smile in portraiture because of the teeth. And so is her beguiling, mysterious smile because he knows something we don't know? Is it just that sort of prosaic, normal configuration? I'm not sure. I don't even know maybe if there's any real knowledge of why she appears to have that kind of, I don't know, mysterious way of looking at us. What's very important though, the way she looks at us directly, that's very unique. And that's very, as I mentioned earlier, very unusual for an aristocratic woman. More an aristocratic man would have that sort of turning and looking at us with very secure posture and temperament. Sorry, I don't think I answered the question, but that is a good point. Mm-hmm. There's so much to say in these paintings, though, and these works of art. I mean, a brief overview. I probably covered too much in too short a time, but that's what we have. Any other questions, Tiffany?
And it looks like we have a question from Ryan asking, in terms of the Timken's own collection, what are the best high Renaissance works what are the best high Renaissance works that we have?
Let's see. I'm trying to think the dates on, wow. I'd have to think about that for a minute. I'd really have to think about that because, Dee Dee, what do you think?
Well, I think obviously we'd like to, I don't know how far along Veronese is on the time frame for Renaissance to high Renaissance, mannerism, all of that. We have the Guercino, and
that's true.
Yeah, and we have the fellow with the arrow by what's his name, the student of Leonardo.
Oh, okay, of course. So we have the Cassio portrait by Botrofio, and so I think that's the perfect. Let me use Dee Dee's comment and just segue into that, because the Botrofio is probably the closest, because it was said that was a Leonardo, and it's painted around the same time as the Mona Lisa, about 1502, 1503, and it was said to be by Leonardo, but it was later determined studio by Botrofio. So that, I think that's the closest one. But there are, the Guercino, the Veronese, of course, Venetian Renaissance, very important. But that is high Italian Renaissance, definitely. Good catch there, Dee Dee. Mm-hmm. Any other questions, Tiffany?
There is one more question from Becky that asks, I think because it is such a large topic, if you would consider doing like a part 2 or a 3, or do kind of like a series on this topic.
That is a really good idea, because I do apologize. I feel like I took a bit off, a little more than I could chew in the terms of there's so much. I wanted to show you a little bit of, even though the high Renaissance is in Florence and in Rome, I wanted to show you the work of Titian, who was very, that Venetian high Renaissance. So yes, I think That would be a great idea. Unfortunately, the next talk I'm doing is on German Renaissance, and that is written in some schedules. So I would probably have to consider continue with the High Renaissance, maybe skipping a month and then coming back. But it is a good point because there's just so much here. And I missed several works of art that I would have loved to have covered, in particular more about the Correggio's contribution. Any other questions?
All right. From the chat, it looks like that's all. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can pop them in and we'll answer those questions for you.
There is a painting in London, which is a composite effort between Verrocchio and Leonardo. And they've done a whole book on that you can pick up if you were interested. And it is the story of Tobias coming back with the angel in the book of Tobit. And they're walking along and they're carrying the fish and so forth. And so the scholars all got into it and said, how do you know that this is both, Verrocchio and Leonardo? And basically the story is, if you look at he was very young, just a newly apprenticed to Verrocchio. Leonardo was very young. And they said, because Leonardo was a left-handed painter, the hair on the angel and on the little dog all went to by a left-handed painter, whereas the rest of the painting and other features are a right-handed painter. They can tell that by the way the paint is laid down. So they were very, very close. Isn't that nice?
Yeah, and it's also when you look at the image I showed with the Credi influence, the Lorenzo Credi, they could attribute it to not only the hands but just the curling of the toes. Yeah. And that was an indicator of his. But as I said earlier, Verrocchio really was a sculptor. So this painting, I think they say maybe only one or two was totally by him, and even that's disputed.
The school children in Italy have a story about Verrocchio and Leonardo. I think I got it right, and it's very short. Basically, they all worked in the workshop. It was time for lunch. Everybody cleared out, but one person usually remained behind to make sure no damage was done or nobody broke in or whatever. And it was Leonardo's turn, and Verrocchio was doing a painting, and he painted a fly on the work that Verrocchio was engaged in that day. He painted a fly in the course of the lunch hour, and Verrocchio came back for lunch and kept trying to get the fly off of
I think I've heard that story. I've heard that story, yes.
Yeah, and then he realized, he got close in and he said, oh my God, that's painted. And then he said, my student is better than I am.
Yes.
He realized.
Yes. Yeah. Like now you proved it, because there's no way that anybody could create something that is so magnificently real. Right. Yeah. That's a good story. That's definitely a good story. All right, Tiffany, any other question?
I think the last thing was a comment asking if we can put the title of that book in the chat.
Which book?
What was it? The one that you referenced?
Oh, you would have to go to the National Gallery in London and ask for the book Verrocchio. I'm sure they know which one it is, and they would tell you the name and you can order it. Yeah, but it's very detailed in how they figured this all out.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I do want to mention that if you're really interested in this topic, you might want to get a copy of Vasari's Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Artists. I mean, you will be right there with everything that's happening at this time. And he was a painter, artist himself. So he tells it from a perspective of knowing some of these people, from the time period, and from these great works of art. So that's another book. Just look under Vasari, The Greatest Work by Vasari, and you'll find it. All righty. Well, thank you all for putting up with me, and we'll see you next month. You're so sweet. See you. Thank you for I always appreciate Dee Dee being able to join us, because you're so knowledgeable about the religious aspects, and it really, I think, lends another dimension. So thank you always. All right. And thank you, Tiffany. Bye-bye now.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And just so if we have any questions, our next talk will be on Thursday, March 9th at 11. But again, thank you so much, Karen, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.